All right, God's heart for the nations, from Genesis to Revelation, part 2, 6 minutes on the clock. Here we go. We left our story of God's heart for the nations at the height of Israel's kingdom under the reign of Solomon. The nations were streaming to Zion. The rulers of the earth were praising Solomon, the king of Israel, for his wisdom. Israel was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. It was a light to the nations. Israel's king didn't just represent the hope that the nation of Israel would know God, but that through Israel, God would save the whole world. That's why Israel's psalms reflect God's heart for all the nations, not just the nation of Israel. Listen to Psalm 67. May God be gracious to us and bless us and make his face shine upon us. That us is Israel. Now, what's the result of God shining his face on Israel? Why should God be gracious to Israel? Verse 2, that your way may be known on earth, your saving power among all nations. Let the peoples praise you, O God. Let the peoples praise you. Let the nations be glad and sing for joy. For you judge the peoples with equity and guide the nations upon earth. Let the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you. So by all appearances, in the reigns of David and Solomon, it seems like God is going to bring the creation project to fruition. In fact, Psalm 72 writes about how God is going to bring all the nations of the earth under the gracious reign of the King of Israel. And it sounds a lot like Solomon's reign. Psalm 72:8, may he have dominion from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. May desert tribes bow down before him and his enemies lick the dust like a serpent. May the kings of Tarshish and of the coastlands render him tribute. May the kings of Sheba and Seba bring gifts. May all kings fall down before him and all nations serve him. But ultimately, that's not what happens. The kings of Israel don't keep obeying God. They don't do what Adam was supposed to do. They don't image God rightly. They don't fulfill the Abrahamic promise and bless all the families of the earth. They rebel. And as goes the king, so go the people. So Solomon's reign starts off well, but by the end, he isn't drawing the nations into the worship of the one true God. He's drawn away by his Gentile wives into worshiping the false gods of the nations. By the time you get to the prophet Isaiah, Israel isn't a light to the Gentiles. They've become just like the Gentiles. Isaiah 1:10, Isaiah calls the nation of Israel Sodom and Gomorrah. Israel isn't blessing the nations. They're being corrupted by the nations. So just like Adam, God sends Israel into the east, into exile. Just like Adam was cast out of the garden, Israel is cast out of the land. And once again, it seems like this whole creation project is over. Where are the promises of Abraham? How will the nations be blessed? With Israel in exile, how will God create for himself a world brimming with people from every family of the earth who image him and worship him rightly? Is all hope lost? Well, not quite. Because the prophets, men like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, they not only announced God's judgment, they also gave a message of hope. The prophets spoke about a day when God would rescue Israel from exile. God would deliver them from Babylon, just like he delivered them out of the nation of Egypt. God would perform a new exodus, a final act of salvation that would restore the nation of Israel, reinstate the Davidic king, and usher in the kingdom of God. But there's something curious about this new exodus. He won't just redeem the nation of Israel from exile. He will include Gentiles in this great act of salvation. The nations of the earth will be brought into the people of God. I wish I could just stop right here and read you the whole book of Isaiah. I can't do that. I only have 6 minutes. So go home and read the first 11 chapters of Isaiah. You'll see this all over the place. Listen to this stunning passage from Isaiah 19:23. In that day, the day of God's salvation, there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria. And Assyria will come into Egypt, and Egypt into Assyria, and the Egyptians will worship with the Assyrians. In that day, Israel will be third with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the earth, whom the Lord of hosts has blessed, saying, "Blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance." Egypt, my people? Assyria, the work of my hands? I mean, how can this be? These are terms God has only applied to Israel. See, God is showing he's not giving up on the creation project. Even after Israel's failure, the nations will come to know the Lord and worship God and image him rightly. The knowledge of the glory of the Lord will cover the dry lands as the waters cover the sea. But how can these idolatrous, unclean Gentile nations be made part of the people of God? Well, Isaiah says it's because they'll come under the reign of Israel's king. In Isaiah 42, Isaiah says that God will save the nations through a servant of the Lord, who is the king of Israel. All the nations will serve him. Isaiah 42:4 says that the coastlands of the Gentiles will wait for his law. They'll live under his reign. So the story of the Old Testament is that God intends to cover the earth with his glory. He intends to build a global kingdom of image bearers that worship him. Adam failed at this task. Israel failed at that task. But before the Old Testament closes, the prophets rang one last note of hope. God would send a new Adam, a new David, a new Israel who would succeed where they failed. The entire creation project would rest on his shoulders, and he would carry it through to the end. It all comes down to one man, the servant of the Lord. As the king of Israel, he would be a light to the Gentiles. He would mediate the blessing of Abraham to the nations. And in a shocking twist, the prophets say he would do all of this by being stricken and smitten and afflicted by God himself. He'd rescue the nations from their idolatry by being judged for their idolatry. He'd save them from sin by suffering for their sin. He'd give the peoples from every nation a standing before God by standing in their place under the judgment of God. That's what we'll consider next time. Thank you.